Well, yeah, well, thanks, Devin, and thanks for the organizers for the invitation, Jen and Megan. Yeah, so follow up some of the conversation here on phytoestrogens as well. We have been engaged in some of that research at UNH. Just the outline of the presentation. So looking at the importance of forage and forage legumes, right, in dairy diets. I'll be sharing data from a study that has been recently published where you're looking at alfalfa versus red clover based diets on several parameters, including milk fatty acids, nutrient utilization in dairy cows, and then some of the environmental factors and management factors that can impact the accumulation of phytoestrogens in legume forage, but with the focus on red clover, right? And then some conclusions from this work. This just starting related to the importance of forage, right? This data from a recent survey. The paper has been accepted, and that's led by Heather Darby lab in UVM. So we're looking at surveying the organic dairy farmers across the U.S. And what they indicated is, it's what I guess we all agree, is that forage, right? It's important, somewhat enhancing or significantly enhancing milk production, body condition score, reproduction, and calving. Good for herd health, quality of the young stock, and also for farm income because you can reduce grain costs, right? So we also looked at the satisfaction of the organic dairy farmers in terms of the forage production systems across the U.S. And in general, they were, somewhat satisfied with the pasture yield and quality, storage forage yield and quality, less in terms of legume content and persistency. So there is some work that could be done there to improve persistency of legumes in pastures. And this is another data set from a study that in this case was led by Kathy Soder, right there. And Amy Hafler was a postdoc that looked at this set of data from farms across the northeast of US, from Maine to Vermont, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and New York. So we collect samples, pasture samples over the years, 3 years, and also looked at botanical composition. And you can see, as expected, there's some variation in the proportion of legumes in those pastures, right? From as low as 22% in 2012 up to 37%. So, but the point here is that we're trying to understand how much legumes are on those pastures in the context of their importance in terms to improve milk production. And this is data from also from UVM, a seed buzzword, what they looked at some, trying to see what the threshold, right, about how much legumes should be in the pastures. And they kind of indicate that roughly you should have at least, I'd say 30% of legumes in those pastures. If we increase that proportion, you start to see less fiber, right? Less NDF, less ADF, and more crude protein. So, and this usually correlates with more intake. As you decrease fiber in the diet, the cows can consume more feed, and that can translate in more milk, right? And looking at this grass and legumes, I'm not advocating here to not having grass on pastures, obviously. But the point here is trying to highlight the importance of legumes, right? And this was a meta-analysis that was published some time ago by folks from Europe, but look at data across, right? Across the temperate climates, where they compare diets that has grass, and this mostly silage, versus legumes, right? And what they saw in that meta-analysis, when legumes results in more intake, right? So usually a 6 to 7% in intake of dry matter, more milk production, and more NH-corrected milk production. So that means that probably the milk components also was higher, like milk fat and milk protein. despite a decrease in digestibility. Organic matter digestibility decrease, so it kind of indicates here that the rate of passage of legumes in the rumen is faster than grasses, so they move fast. It's less digestible, the cows consume more, so that counteracts the drop in digestibility, right? So again, that's highlights here the importance of legumes. And then in the same study, they break out, right, the different types of legumes. And also they did for grasses, but I'm just showing here the legumes. And either white clover, red clover, alfalfa, buzzwood, trefoil. And in general, right, you can see that both white clover and bird's foot trefoil, but specifically bird's foot trefoil, it did increase dry matter intake, produce more milk and more energy-corrected milk compared to red clover or even alfalfa, and even superior to white clover. Statistically, as you can see, it's not different, but numerically, you can see that's a big difference in some of those traits there, production traits. And then look only at red clover and alfalfa, which is kind of the focus of this talk today here, at least in one of the studies that we're showing. Oftentimes, those are equivalent, right? You can see in terms of intake, milk production, and energy-corrected milk, they're relatively similar. But one thing I have seen in a lot of studies, and also here in this meta-analysis, which basically combined data from several studies, was that red clover often results in diets that are more digestible. See, organic matter digestibility was higher here in red clover. You see that with fiber, NDF, EDF, but this not often translate into more milk. So you would expect, okay, more digestible, more energy, more milk production, and that doesn't happen with red clover. And you try to understand energy partition in diets with red clover versus alfalfa. So that's where showing some of the data here on that regard as well. Going back to that survey across the US, we just trying to understand what the proportion of farmers grow different types of perennial grasses or perennial legumes. And not surprised here, 83% of those farmers, they do have orchard grass on their pasture mix or in their hay fields. And this survey was more populated with farmers from the Northeast region, so that can explain maybe the high level of orchard grass in those farms. And in terms of legumes, you can see that 87 and 86% of those farmers indicated they do have those legumes in their fields, right? So that's, of course, highlights the importance to be looking at red clover also, as important legume. One thing that's about red clover, that in addition to the phytoestrogens, red clover also has this other bioactive compound called polyphenol oxidase, or PPO. It's an enzyme that basically oxidizes phenols to quinones in the presence of oxygen. And ultimately, what it basically does is protect against proteolysis or degradation of proteins. During siling, right, if you make a silage of red clover, you have less proteolysis, less breakdown of proteins. And this translates oftentimes in cows having better efficiency of nitrogen utilization, right? So, so that's another aspect of red clover that that's important to consider. And in addition to inhibit the breakdown of protein, it also inhibits some enzymes as well, like lipase that can break down fatty acids and things along those lines. So when you look at red clover, right, so one thing that's consistent, right, is it reduced ammonia formation in the rumen. Is that associated with the pyracantine, probably the hyperammonia bacteria? But if you're talking about silage, it's probably associated with that PPO enzyme that basically reduced the proteolysis, the breakdown of protein, so there is less ammonia formation in the rumen in those cows. So with less ammonia in the rumen, you usually have less urea, right? So less nitrogen being excreted to the environment. A proxy to that, to look at that, is MUN, or mucourea nitrogen. When you see diets with red clover, you also see lower levels of MUN, or mucourea nitrogen, indicating that improved nitrogen utilization in those animals, right? So that's kind of give you a little bit of the background why you're looking at red clover. And this was a study that I'll be sharing some data, just to keep in mind that this was diets, high forage diets with baleage, right? So, and this was fed to organic cows. So just very briefly here, the nutrient composition of the baleage, you use two types of baleage, two different cuttings, either alfalfa or red clover in second and third cut. What I'm going to show here is what I said, soluble protein. You can see that's much lower in the red clovers compared to the alfalfas, right? So, and that's primarily driven by that enzyme polyphenol oxidase that reduce breakdown of proteins during siling. Another aspect that to look at here, other than that, you see the NDF, ADF, lignin was all similar, but red clover seems to have, as compared to alfalfa, more sugars. You can see the data there, and while alfalfa seems to have more starch, right? So in terms of the non-structural carbohydrates, so more sugars for red clover, more starch for alfalfa. And that's the diets. We fed a 65 to 35 forage to concentrate ratio, the same grain blend of the concentrate, and then what vary in these diets, either alfalfa or red clover. And you can see some of the nutrient composition of the diets. It was relatively similar in terms of ADF, NDF, crude protein, and net energy. So we did, series of samplings on these animals, across time. So we have an adaptation period, and then series of samplings on 4 weeks after we start the study, and then on week 7 after we start the study. So this was a study that lasts about 7 to 8 weeks. We did collect gas emissions of these animals. The goal here is not feeding red clover or alfalfa to mitigate methane, but to try to understand energetic losses, right? So methane represents energy losses by the animal. So we use the green feed system. I'm not sure if folks are familiar here, but it's basically a new, not too new now. Technology has been out there for maybe 15 years now, close to that. It basically have a bait. The cow's going to trigger the system. It releases a bait, and then the cows are consuming and breathing and belching. So there is sensors here that can measure methane, CO2, oxygen, hydrogen, so you can have an idea in terms of the gaseous emissions from these animals. In this study, also collect rumen fluid, milk production, milk composition, urine and feces and blood. So in this way, you can, estimate urinary excretion, digestibility of nutrients, circulating ammonia, amino acids, and things along those lines. And for the rumen fluid, we analyze for ammonia and the VFAs, the volatile fatty acids that Brittany was talking about here. So here's some of the data of this study. So we did not see any effect on dry matter intake or milk yield difference. However, energy-corrected milk was higher in alfalfa, and also feed efficiency, if you express here in milk production over dry matter intake. So those are higher in alfalfa, and this probably associated this increase in energy-corrected milk with the milk fat. So we did not see a difference in milk fat percentage or milk protein percentage or lactose percentage or some of those milk components, but milk fat yield, right, tend to be higher in the alfalfa diet. So that pushed that energy-corrected milk to be also higher, right? We look at the milk fatty acids, and as I said before, this enzyme, polyphenol oxidase, it tends to block the lipase, the enzymes that break down lipids, and that reduce the biohydrogenation processes that takes place in the rumen. So in other words, it preserves more of the unsaturated fatty acids. And what you can see here is that the alpha-linolenic acids, the major omega-3 fatty acids, so the total omega-3 fatty acids and that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio decrease, right? So in other words, red clover had result in milk with more omega-3 fatty acids, and also with a better omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, right? The lower, the better, we know was related to human health, right? So, and this is also an important aspect when you look at human health and things along those lines. So in terms of nitrogen utilization, as I said before, that enzyme polyphenol oxidase, or maybe some of these phytoestrogens, maybe together here. So as I said, several studies have been showing, we confirmed this again here, that red clover usually reduced, right? So those MUN or plasma urea nitrogen, urinary excretion to the environment, ruminal ammonia nitrogen, you can see very clear here. And that, again, is important when you look at the environmental impacts of dairy systems, right? So there's some forage by week interactions. You can see most of the response happened during week 4 and last during week 7. But overall, right, you see this reduction or improvement in nitrogen use efficiency. In terms of digestibility, again, so this happened also in this study. You can see that digestibility of dry matter, organic matter, and fiber and NDF all higher in red clover diets, but that was not translating to more milk production. In fact, NH-corrected milk did decrease when the cows are fed red clover. So we're trying to understand what's going on in terms of the energetics, right? So this is the typical energy partition in diet. So you go a lot from gross energy up to net energy, and then there is energetic losses. So the animal is going to lose energy through feces, right, to gas, primarily methane, urinary, and primarily nitrogen out of the urine, and also the animals generate heat during digestion processes. That's the heat increment. So we can use the calorimetric bomb, right, to measure some of those energy in some of those matrices, like milk or feces or urine. We have been using the green feed, right, to estimate, to measure methane, also CO2 and hydrogen and oxygen. You can estimate urinary energy. We didn't this study with this equation, but you can also use the calorimetric bomb to measure directly. Heat production, we measure with this equation, rely on carbon dioxide, right, emissions, and this coming from the green feed system. And then you can measure net energy intake, or estimate net energy with the NASEM, the new NASEM equation, with the old NRC. And then tissue energy you can estimate by subtracting metabolizable energy from heat production, milk energy. So you get metabolizable energy. You get back calculate to get tissue energy, and then milk energy you can estimate with the equation also from the NASEM. So using this process here can, is a mix of measurements and estimation through equations, right? There is some uncertainties when you do that, but that's the only way to do it. So in terms of gas production, what you saw here is that there's an effect, still not completely understand this effect, but if the red clover diets did decrease methane production, and this was a little bit surprising in the sense that there's no effect on intake. So it's a little bit difficult to explain this response here. But when you looked at carbon methane yield, which is grams of methane per kilogram of dry matter intake, or methane intensity, it's grams of methane per kilogram of NH-corrected milk, there's no difference there, right, per kilogram of product, right? Not going to spend too much time in this table here, but just you can see the breakdown of the energetic calculation, and highlighting some points here. So in the case of red clover diets, that has less fecal energy because the diets are more digestible, less urinary energy because they excrete less nitrogen, right, as shown earlier, and less methane energy because they produce less methane. And another two aspects here was that milk energy was low in red clover because less milk, less energy, correct, milk, less milk fat. And tissue energy, that's what I think is some interesting here. Tissue energy, that's retained energy in the tissues of this animal, seems to be higher in red clover. So it kind of indicates that some of this energy partition is, rather than going to milk production, it seems to go into accumulate body tissue, right? So, and this, you can calculate this through efficiency. You can see in this case here, that's metabolizable energy. The cows on red clover, they were less efficient to convert metabolizable energy into milk energy, as you can see here, primarily during week 4 of the study. And they were more efficient, or maybe less efficient, to convert metabolizable energy into tissue energy. So in other words, the energy partition seemed to be going towards more accumulation of tissue rather than to milk production. So I don't know the mechanism behind this, but that's what some of this data is indicating. So I think we need more studies to look into this energetics of forage in general, right? So switching gears here now to the phytoestrogen conversation. So Britton was discussing, right, primarily about the flavonoids. I also have other classes of phytoestrogens, the lignans and the stilbenes. I don't know how to pronounce this, but anyways, they're difficult overall. The isoflavones are common in some of the clovers that we just discussed, and what's the focus here of this conversation. What I want to say here, these phytoestrogens, now the name is there for a reason, right? So you can see the molecule of estrogen there, and genistein is a type of phytoestrogen. They structurally very similar, and this could have some negative effects, right? There's some positive effects, like Britton discussed, but it's potentially some negative effects associated with phytoestrogens. And some of them are here. And you can see this data, lots of review was looking at in the human literature. You can see the phytoestrogen has been associated to be beneficial to reduce menopausal symptoms in women, right? Reduce cardiovascular disease or obesity, type 2 diabetes, improve brain function, reduce cancers. But you see all the question marks there because there's no consistency or not enough data. On the other hand, there is potential negative impacts on human health from endocrine disruption. You can reduce thyroid function, reduce brain function. Some breast cancer, in fact, could increase. So there is like a little bit of a black box there where we don't know if the benefits outweigh the risks or not. So it basically needs more data on this phytoestrogen story here. So again, when you look at the animal itself, and this, I was in Australia this past summer as a part of the visiting some university and discussing about phytoestrogens, because they have a lot of issues there with the sheep, primarily associated with reproduction issues, infertility. Their clovers, they have different types of clovers that have the high levels of these phytoestrogens as well. And what's here's kind of the general metabolism of isoflavones. In fact, the animals consumed, there is this extensive metabolization in the rumen of some of these compounds, producing one of the major ones, the qual. It's highly active, one of the more bioactive. That's what you're going to potentially find in milk that you're drinking. And of course, some of this equal can circulate in the blood and potentially, right, mimic estrogens, right? But they don't have that. They have weak or strong effect, and depending on how those interactions take place, it can, eventually disrupt reproduction, cause infertility, cause embryonic losses, and but there is not much data on cows. There's some data on sheep, on cows. We don't know much about it. So these are the potential negative effects, and there is potential benefits, right? As Britton discussed, increasing growth rate, weight gain, improved nitrogen utilization. So we need to better understand, right, where we are in terms of this phytoestrogen situation. And here is an example of a study that was done, I think, in Norway, where they collect milk samples and buy milk samples, retail milk samples, organic and conventional. And you can see pretty clear here on the top line there, that is organic milk, right? So in general, organic milk has this higher level of phytoestrogens compared to conventional milk. And this potentially associated with organic, right? More forage in the diets or pasture-based diets, more clover intake. Conventional, we know, is more TMR-based. You have less forage and maybe less grains that would cause some of these effects. But you can see that equal, for instance, it's very high levels compared to the other phytoestrogens that indicate that a lot of the, for instance, biochanin A, not biochanin A, but formononetine, which is another phytoestrogen, is converted into equal, and daidzein also converted into equal. So, and we don't have data like this here in the US yet, as far as I know. We're looking at, actually, me, not necessarily, but my student, and I'm co-advising with Rich Smith. And Palash has done a lot of studies looking at factors that can impact phytoestrogens, right? So, that's his agronomic factors, forage cultivars, like Britton was discussing here, the biotic, abiotic effect, insects. So he came up with a set of studies for his PhD. One of them was looking at insect herbivory, how insects could potentially impact the concentration of those phytoestrogens. And he looked at red clover and cuta clover. Cuta clover, it's supposedly to be no phytoestrogenic. That's some gray literature showing that. Now we have some data on this, but what they show in this first study, they show a species by treatment interaction, meaning you can see that this increased response, right, in formononetine, which is one of the most important phytoestrogens in clover, and also biochanin A, when the insect promote that damage in the leaves, right? So phytoestrogens is a way that the plants use also to, as a mechanism of defense, is an antioxidant for them. So they are defense mechanisms. So when they stress, they can accumulate those phytoestrogens. And you can see here, so if stressed by a insect, right, it can cause increase in phytoestrogen over 100% here. You can see the formononetine, the biochanin A, and the total phytoestrogens there. So it has been some data showing that levels of about 3 milligrams per gram of phytoestrogen could be dangerous for sheep. We don't have data for cows. Dangerous, what I'm talking about here, mostly in terms of affecting their reproduction. He also did another study where he looked at the effect of drought and waterlogging. And this, again, this is on the greenhouse studies, where they have a control, basically 100% water holding capacity, and they have a drought, which is 40% water holding capacity, with 20 days of that, and then 10 days of drought only, either waterlogging for 20 days and waterlogging at 10 days. Again, it's trying to promote stress in these plants. You can see here in the middle, that's the control plants that was, supposedly in the best conditions. You can see, then you have in the left side would be the drought, my left side, and then in the waterlogging, you can see that the plants are affected. So he did see an effect, right, on the red clover, and in this study, and a huge increase again with the drought. 20 days drought, it caused about 100% increase in the total phytoestrogens concentration. There are no phytoestrogens in cuta clover in this study, so we were able to find very small amounts in the first study, but no phytoestrogens that was detected, let's say, detected by the instrument, right? In terms of the other phytoestrogens here, the formonantine and biotin A, so you can see those are the total. Now I'll break them down into the species. You can see the right there pulling this up on that 20-day drought treatment. Again, that's certainly above that level that's considered safe for sheep. And then when you look at the other ones, there's minor phytoestrogens that are also present there, like daidzein, for instance. You can see that one kind of interesting that it responds to waterlogging. It increased, but not with the drought. So in the other two minor phytoestrogens here, pyrinetin and you can see the same, it responds to both, right? So either drought, 20-day drought, or the waterlogging, either 20 or 10 days, cause that increase, right? So that's kind of, interesting. It seems to, depending on the type of phytoestrogen and the stress, the plant responds differently, right? And just this showing that in red clover, the most of the phytoestrogen that you're going to see there, independent of the stress or not stress, is either it's both formononitine in green there, and that biotin A is the one in kind of a gold color there. So it's quite clear. Those are the two most important, and when you're looking at ways to manage, so those ones would be more in line. So, and just to finalize here, we also look at the effect of cutting management. This was done in the field, in the plots. So the treatment here was basically, we have legume grass mixtures, right? We have either orchard grass, white clover, or orchard grass and red clover treatment. And you have either intensive cutting, was 5 times a year, versus less intensive, 3 times a year, in different heights at 5 or 10 centimeters height. That was the treatment. The height, cutting height did not affect the phytoestrogens. However, the frequency did affect. So the more, and this is a total phytoestrogen, so the more intense the cutting management, it increased the phytoestrogen significantly. The total in white clover, there is no effect. And you can see, if you see the y-axis, like Britton was discussing, and of these two graphs, that you can see that the concentration of phytoestrogen in red clover is much, much higher than that in white clover, right? And then when you look at the other phytoestrogens, like for instance, basically now speciating them. So formononitine was the one that caused that increase, and biotin A increased, but not statistically. And the other two here, the daidzein and the glycine, these two, it decreased, right, with the more cutting. So again, that's a little bit difficult to explain here, but it seems that the mechanism behind controlling this is not fully understood, but it seems that it does affect one more than other one, depending on the management that you're applying into the system there. And then to summarize, so we have some time for questions, right? Compare with grasses, legumes, based on that meta-analysis, it does increase dry matter intake and milk production, despite a reduction in digestibility. So in other words, that increased dry matter intake counteract, right, the drop in digestibility when you have legumes. Compared to alfalfa, the red clover improve nitrogen utilization, nutrient digestibility, omega-3 fatty acids in milk, but did decrease NH-corrected milk, and this may be associated with that energy partition that we discussed. Phytoestrogen in red clover increase, right, in response to stressors, and either for insect infestation to drought, waterlogging, all of them was able to increase those levels of phytoestrogens. But it's important more research on energy partition in forage, right? In general, there is very sparse data in that system. and also trying to understand the mechanism of this phytoestrogen response. You know that it can change, but what is regulating those change, it's not, you know, it needs for sure more research, right? So I'll acknowledge the funding source of this project, USDA and Northeast SARE and New Hampshire College of Life Science and Agriculture, the organizers for the invitation, and I would open to questions